And now we'll lead off with a text from James, the first chapter, verses 19 and 20. James 1, 19 and 20. This you know, my beloved brethren, but everyone must be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. For the anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of God. Brethren, this theme text, and their discussion for this next portion of an hour, is rooted in this verse that I'm really coming to appreciate more and more. I come to you fully convinced of the necessity of the things I'm about to share, and knowing that I myself have a long and steep hill of personal growth ahead of me still. After our local ecclesia studied James a few years ago, many familiar verses jumped out at me and grabbed my attention on a more personal level. One of the earliest written books in our Bible, James is full of some very valuable advice, from the importance of both faith and works to the importance of even the least of God's commandments to us. And our theme text is one which I have known for a long time, but one which it is becoming increasingly apparent is of vital importance to each and every one of us. When initially preparing these thoughts, my first impulse was to spend time talking about all three of the components of this passage, some time about being quick to hear and slow to speak and slow to anger. However, you'll know it's really difficult to separate being quick to hear and being slow to speak. You really can't be a good listener unless you learn to control the urge to talk or respond. Listening is important, not only in our interpersonal relationships, but also for our spiritual growth. We read in the 3rd chapter of Galatians that the works of the law alone do not serve our spiritual growth. Galatians 3, verses 2, 3, and 5. This is the only thing I want to find out from you. Did you receive the Spirit by the works of the law, or by hearing with faith? Are you so foolish? Having begun by the Spirit, are you now being perfected by the flesh? So then, does he who provides you with the Spirit and works miracles among you do it by the works of the law, or by hearing with faith? It is by faithful listening that we can be properly led of the Spirit. But it is not enough to simply listen. We must listen the right way. Consider for a moment the opposite of our theme verse. Be slow to hear, quick to speak, and quick to anger. Do you ever reflect back on your actions and realize you've been slow to hear and quick to speak? I think it's a very human reaction, and one we slip into easily if we don't continually remain vigilant. Do you ever find while listening that you are anxiously waiting for your chance to speak? Possibly you think you already know what's going to be said. Or maybe you feel your thought is so very important, or like me, you want to get that thought out before your brain moves on to another thought. Or maybe you're bored, or you're distracted by the TV, or a passerby, or your phone, or you're so busy deciding how you want to respond, or maybe you're even rejecting what's being shared with you because you know better. Or maybe some combination of all of these things. Brethren, we need to exercise patience when listening. Being a good listener requires actively filtering distractions. It requires effort. Don't try to multitask. Don't keep an eye on your favorite show or the news. Don't keep an ear on whatever program is currently on the radio. Make the speaker the most important person in the room. It is a matter of character development to quench the fleshly impulse to spend more time reacting than perceiving. And when you honestly look back upon it, do you think you'll ever say to yourself, I really wish I had listened less to my good friend that day and more to that random story on the radio? 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 12 reads, And may the Lord cause you to increase and abound in love for one another, and for all people, just as we also do for you. How do we abound in love for our brethren? How do we demonstrate our overflowing love for them? Is it by telling them what we think they need to hear? Is it by half listening to them? Or is it by focusing on them exclusively and showing them they're important to us and listening to their needs? Being a good listener is an act of love, and we must practice loving our brethren. Consider Philippians 2:3. Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind regard one another as more important than yourselves. And of course, 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 4 and 5. You all know this one. Love is patient. Love is kind and is not jealous. Love does not brag and is not arrogant, does not act unbecomingly. It does not seek its own, is not provoked, does not take into account a wrong suffered. When someone truly needs to talk to you, it's important to focus on what they need to tell you. Sometimes this doesn't come out right away. Maybe they don't immediately know how to put it into words. Maybe they need time to process and talk through their thoughts and their feelings. When this happens, when a person pauses in thought, it can be tempting to interject our own thoughts and feelings on the matter. Proverbs has a surprising number of warnings about speaking and listening. For example, Proverbs 18, verse 2 and 13. A fool does not delight in understanding, but only in revealing his own mind. He who gives an answer before he hears, it is folly and shame to him. I love that that's in the Proverbs. I think that at a time like this, when we're focusing on good behavior and we're not caught up in an emotional conversation, it's easy to recognize these kinds of things would be bad ideas. But when you're in a conversation with somebody and you feel you have answers for them, it can be tempting to let your desire to help or your excitement to share what you believe outweigh the necessity of quietly listening. A good listener asks questions, but primarily seeks to understand, not to tell or explain. This is one reason why we should be slow to speak. We need to strive not to be pushy, but to show genuine concern, to value the feelings of others and to validate them through our words and our tone and our body language. Proverbs chapter 20, verse 5. A plan in the heart of a man is like deep water, but a man of understanding draws it out. We all have the ability within us to draw out the thoughts and plans and goals of others, but it is a skill that takes time to develop, and it takes practice to strengthen. Given enough time, we can build it into a habit. But as with so many things worth doing, it won't be easy. It will take determination and commitment. And good listening is not just something we think is a good idea. It's part of our ministry. In Ephesians 4:11, we read, "And he gave some as apostles, and some as prophets, and some as evangelists, and some as pastors and teachers." Now, I know this is a familiar verse, but I believe it applies on multiple levels. I think here the Apostle Paul's message applies both to those charged with growing that early church to whom he was writing, and to all who have committed to serving our Lord throughout the gospel age. So when he references apostles and prophets and so on, I think he's describing this variety of gifts and strengths that we all have. If we strip away the implied meaning of some of these words, because when I say pastor, you likely immediately think of a church leader, but that's not the original meaning. And when we look at the actual Greek, what we find is that some have a talent to be messengers, to be interpreters of divine will, to be spreaders of the good news, to be shepherds who provide guidance and instructors. And so it's on the pastor or the shepherd that I want to focus right now. I think we can each support our brethren and give guidance at one time or another. And we can only effectively do that if we're good listeners. Yes, some instinctively get it better than others. Some perhaps have a greater gift of empathy, but we all can learn to do a better job. And one step in that process is practice. Hopefully, some of the points we're discussing here can provide food for reflection and tips for growth that we all might be better able to serve and support our brethren. It doesn't necessarily have to be about direction and direct assistance either. Sometimes, and I'll credit my wife with helping me understand this, the act of simply listening to someone can assist with the release of emotions that are causing stress or pain. And many times that is the only thing necessary to help them address or resolve their problem, just the listening. I'm sure there are many in the audience who are thinking, well, yeah, that's obvious. But let me tell you, for some of us, I speak from experience, it could be a completely new concept. Even after a number of years being aware of this and attempting to practice it, I still find my mind slipping into old patterns and expectations and feeling the need to solve things for others. Consider, brethren, if we are not slow to speak, we may misunderstand what we're hearing and address the wrong issue. Or worse, we can come across offensively, as if we weren't properly listening or understanding at all. All of the best intentions and goodwill in the world are worthless if we don't really hear what our brother or sister is trying to tell us. And it's an even bigger problem if, after all that, we give the impression that we weren't really listening. Have you ever been in that kind of a conversation where you realize suddenly that they're thinking about something else? If we do that to someone, will that brother come to us again? Will that sister feel comfortable opening up to someone who just doesn't seem to get it? Closely related to this is the need for us to put aside our pride and ourself when we're listening. If we are mentally defending ourselves and explaining our actions, even just internally, we're not putting enough focus on listening with the intent to understand. Yes, it is our nature to anticipate where a story is going or what the point of an argument might be. However, our human nature is not the one we want to be cultivating here. We need to practice listening without formulating an opinion, to practice listening without judging the intent of the speaker, to practice listening without weighing the validity of someone's feelings. We have to wait until we have the full story before we should begin to contemplate our opinion or our response. Now, this seems like it might be a little thing, brethren, but we're told that if we are untrustworthy in the little things, how much less trustworthy are we in the larger, more important matters? Could the same be true for the way we practice listening? If we don't listen well to our friends and family and our brethren, how well will we truly listen to the voice of God in our lives and the leading of His Spirit? Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a German Lutheran pastor who lived during the Second World War, once wrote, "Anyone who thinks that his time is too valuable to spend keeping quiet will eventually have no time for God and his brother, but only for himself and his own follies." Think about that. When I think of that, the word pride quickly comes to mind. That attitude is an attitude of the flesh and one that we need to be on guard against. And good listening offers us a double blessing. Not only do we gain a blessing from truly hearing our brethren and bonding with them and serving them as best we can, we furthermore exercise the opportunity to be a blessing to those in need. Think for a moment of a stressful interaction you've had amongst the brethren. Perhaps a time when you felt at odds with your brother or sister. Now call that moment to mind, and then ask yourself, in that process, did you really understand the wants and needs of that other brother or sister? It's possible some of you absolutely can say that. But I know that in my most stressful moments and frustrations, I often become so centered on myself and my convictions that I'm not nearly as focused on the others as I ought to be. Might we all do a better job of listening so that we might better understand each other? Becoming a better listener will help us not only listen to our brethren, but also to listen to His leading in our lives. Think for a moment of the best example of a good listener the Bible gives us. To me, the easy answer is Jesus. Where else do we have someone who had our best interest at heart, who we could completely trust to care for what we had to say, who we knew would not be judgmental, and who had no place he'd rather be than right there beside us? For example, when Jesus passed by Bartimaeus, and this is Mark chapter 10, verses 46 through 52, they came to Jericho, and as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a large crowd, a blind beggar named Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the road. When he heard that it was Jesus the Nazarene, he began to cry out and say, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Many were sternly telling him to be quiet, but he kept crying out all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Can you imagine that? Put yourself in the place of the bystanders for a moment. No doubt they're thinking to themselves, "This is Jesus of Nazareth. He has more important things to do than be harassed by this blind beggar. Let us shush that beggar so he does not disturb the master." And then think of how Jesus might have felt, or to be more accurate, how we might have felt in that position. Imagine you're on your way out of town. We have things to do, we have places to be. Compare it to modern times. We just got on the road and we're not stopping until the next rest area in 150 miles. But as we read on, Jesus stopped and said, and this is verse 49, "Call him here." So they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take courage, stand up. He is calling for you." Throwing aside his cloak, he jumped up and came to Jesus. And answering him, Jesus said, "What do you want me to do for you?" And the blind man said to him, "Rabboni, I want to regain my sight." And Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and began following him on the road. Now, the obvious message here is one of the importance of faith. However, we can also take from it a lesson for how we should be open to listening to those in need, even if it might be an inconvenient time. We shouldn't be frustrated as if our brethren are delaying us or imposing upon us. Of course, that's the ideal. We're going to fall short for sure. But it is still important to have the ideal in mind as a goal that we might work toward. Think also of the woman at the well in John 4. It is a long passage and too long to read here, but you know that Jesus came to a well and asked a Samaritan woman for a drink. They became involved in a conversation and he was able to witness to her. But the interesting point is that he took his time to converse with her. He didn't lecture her, but rather gave her tiny pieces of truth and let her slowly come to grips with them and respond to him and ask questions before he threw out the next little bit. He knew what she needed, and he responded in the way she needed. Now, of course, we don't have the same degree of understanding he was able to bring to bear, but I see in this a lesson that we must be patient in our conversation, and we should seek the leading of the Spirit and the Lord's will for us. An evangelist by the name of Dawson Trotman once said, "Thoughts disentangle themselves when they pass through the lips and fingertips." Sometimes the act of talking about something or writing about something can be a huge benefit to our own minds, assisting us in making sense of things. In this way, both the act of speaking and listening can be a blessing to us every bit as much as to our brethren. It's been a number of years since I was working on my degree in mathematics, but I can recall numerous occasions where I was stuck with a seemingly insurmountable problem. I would butt my head against it over and over, but come away often no better understanding or with any idea of how to proceed. But then an instructor taught me that explaining my problem, just explaining it to my wife, would often bring the answers I needed. Now, to be clear, she quite frequently had no idea what I was talking about, but it didn't matter. That wasn't the point. I needed the act of putting my ideas into words to help my brain organize its thinking. And so, though my intent here was to focus on the book of James, I was surprised at how it turned out that so many wonderful bits of advice on hearing and listening could be found in Proverbs. For example, Proverbs 25, verses 11 and 12. Like apples of gold in settings of silver is a word spoken in right circumstances. Like an earring of gold and an ornament of fine gold is a wise reprover to a listening ear. Doesn't that apply beautifully to our topic? Having the right thing to say at the right time isn't easy, but it's valuable. That should be our goal as much as possible. But you don't often get there by speaking quickly. You need to take time to understand, to consider your thoughts and your words carefully. Think how often we lead off a conversation with the real point. I know I often prefer to lay the groundwork carefully so someone can truly understand where I'm coming from and where my thoughts are going. Maybe it's a case where I'm just not comfortable saying exactly what I want to, or maybe I'm feeling people out to make sure they're open and receptive before I share an idea that I'm sensitive about which I might fear rejection or invalidation. And here it is listening that takes us past these emotional barriers because it tells the speaker we care, we're safe to talk to, and we're trustworthy. Again from Proverbs, this time chapter 27, verse 9. Oil and perfume make the heart glad. So a man's counsel is sweet to his friends. S.I. Hayakawa, a Californian senator from the 1970s, once said, "Listening requires entering actively and imaginatively into another person's situation and trying to understand a frame of reference different from your own. There are many scriptures and quotations shared in our thoughts today, but that may be my favorite because I think it absolutely gets to the most important point, that true listening requires us to understand the perspective of another. It's hard enough to really understand our brethren when we come to the table with vast differences in upbringing and values and history and experience. But it's even harder when we can't let go of our certainty and our prior judgments for a time and fully put ourselves in their shoes. When trying to listen, ask yourself, what does this brother or sister mean? What are they really saying to me? What is at the core of his or her feelings? Listening is different from conversing, though we sometimes use these words interchangeably. I think conversing implies a meeting in the middle, a sharing of ideas, of stories, of feelings from both sides. But when we're actively listening, we make a concerted effort to clamp down on those. And for some of us, myself included, this can be extremely difficult. But we want to give the speaker the space to continue. When listening, do we ever find ourselves thinking about what we need to do later? Are we checking the time or our email on our phone? Do we want our friend to get to the point so we can get on with the day or our very important business? I don't think we often do this to our friends, but I do believe it can happen. Are we fully present and listening purposefully? This is one of the hardest parts because it really means clamping down on the flesh. We need to practice over and over again, and we will likely have to practice for the rest of our lives because the flesh won't stop fighting us until it's good and truly dead. But we know that this practice will pay off, for we read in Isaiah chapter 50, verse 4, "The Lord God has given me the tongue of disciples, that I may know how to sustain the weary one with a word. He awakens me morning by morning. He awakens my ear to listen as a disciple." And good listening includes paying attention to nonverbal communication as well. For example, people's facial expressions or body language or their tone of voice. Now, as I searched for and read others' thoughts on the value of listening, I came across an interesting checklist for recognizing when somebody is not listening, when they're not listening. And I'd like to share it with you now. When I'm thinking about an answer while others are talking, I'm not listening. When I give unsolicited advice, I'm not listening. When I suggest they shouldn't feel the way they do, I'm not listening. When I apply a quick fix, I'm not listening. When I fail to acknowledge their feelings, I'm not listening. When I fail to maintain eye contact, I'm not listening. When I don't ask follow-up questions, I'm not listening. When they share a difficult experience and I counter with one of my own, I'm not listening. Really, all I have to do is listen. I don't have to talk. Just listen. What do you think of that list, brethren? I know that when I read it, I found myself guilty of more than a few of those. I think I especially like the ending because by contrast, it shows the most important piece is reining in our own tongue. So let's take a moment to focus on how we should practice being slow to speak. This means waiting to speak until after you've thought things through and choosing your words carefully. We already read about how love is patient and love is kind. And so it's important to remember to be patient with our brethren and give them the time to express themselves fully. We read in Proverbs 10, verse 19, "When there are many words, transgression is unavoidable, but he who restrains his lips is wise." Sometimes waiting can help us in several ways. One, it can help us recognize and avoid an impulsive or foolish or fleshly response. Two, it can help give us a moment to talk with God, asking for insight and direction. Three, it can help us formulate a response or a clarifying question. Exercising our bodies can develop what's known as muscle memory, which is a term that describes how our bodies can be trained through repetition to fall into good habits. For example, athletes that want to run a certain way or jump a certain way or throw a certain way repeatedly go through the motions so their bodies will fall back upon habit at a critical moment and just do the right thing, even although it's unconscious. And likewise, we can develop a similar habit in our communication so that even when we're not consciously trying to be slow to speak, it can be our habit to do so. If we develop this, our speech will be much more helpful and valuable to our brethren. Proverbs chapter 16, verses 23 and 24. The heart of the wise instructs his mouth and adds persuasiveness to his lips. Pleasant words are a honeycomb, sweet to the soul and healing to the bones. We know it's a lifelong struggle attempting to control the tongue. We see this in James 3:6. James 3:6. And the tongue is a fire, the very world of iniquity. The tongue is set among our members as that which defiles the entire body. Sometimes the best thing to do is to know when to remain silent and what not to say. Proverbs 25:28. Like a city that is broken into and without walls is a man who has no control over his spirit. Now, everything comes faster and faster these days. There's not a lot of writing letters. There's no more developing your film at the photomat. And even brewing your coffee at home has become a case of instant gratification. We don't have to wait for our meals because we have fast food. Many of us can't be bothered to drive across the country and we fly, or at least we used to. We can't wait for our favorite show or movie or book. We want to get it right now. But we can get so caught up in the benefits of speed, we lose sight of the benefits of taking it slow. In fact, some of us are finding that now to be true as we have more time at home. And we find that by delaying our speech, we can avoid saying something we might regret. Matthew, the 12th chapter, verses 36 and 37. But I tell you that every careless word that people speak, they shall give an accounting for it in the day of judgment. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. And Proverbs 18, verse 13. He who gives an answer before he hears, it's folly and shame to him. Many of you will no doubt recall the school ground rhyme, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me. There is something admirable in the sentiment there, but I think we all know it's not quite that easy. Words can and do hurt us. So we need to guard the tongue, to train it to behave as the new creature directs, and not as the flesh. And we need to be ever vigilant because it will sneak up on you when your guard is down, when you're tired or upset, when you're busy. The psalmist addresses this in Psalms chapter 141, verse 3. Set a guard, O Lord, over my mouth. Keep watch over the door of my lips. There's great power in our words, to do good or to do evil. We can use them to build up our brethren or to tear them down. And that starts with our heart attitude. For as we read in Luke chapter 6, verse 45, the good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth what is good. And the evil man out of the evil treasure brings forth what is evil. For his mouth speaks from that which fills his heart. And we know from Proverbs chapter 18, verse 21, that death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love it will eat its fruit. Though we're running short on time, we also want to take a brief look at the exhortation to be slow to anger. It has been said that the size of a man may be measured by the size of the things that make him angry. When do we get angry? What triggers it? And what do we do to control that anger? I am by no means an expert on anger, but I've definitely learned a thing or two about what makes me angry over the past several decades. And I know that some of the main contributors are, and again, this is for me, and this is not a complete list, when I insist on trying to change someone's opinion, when I have a fixed idea of a desired outcome and things don't go according to plan, when I'm not fully present in a conversation, but selfishly considering only my own views, and when I'm not fully present in a conversation because I'm distracted by other demands and pressures. When we try to force things to our own view of the world, we're setting ourselves up for disappointment and frustration. The only person we really have control over is ourselves. We can explain our views to others. We can answer questions about our views. But when our sharing becomes more than a simple exchange of ideas and begins to grow into convincing, or worse, coercion, then there is a strong possibility of frustration and defensiveness. Therefore, it's important to practice self-analysis, to always be on the lookout for how we might be overstepping with our brethren. We read in Proverbs chapter 20, verse 3, "Keeping away from strife is an honor for a man, but any fool will quarrel." Another source of anger is when we slip up in our vigilance. These slip-ups amount to unpreparedness, and the unpreparedness can come from distraction and a lack of presence in the conversation. When you're fully engaged and giving your undivided attention, when you're listening with the right heart attitude and not trying to do more than simply understand your brother or sister, it's considerably less likely you will become frustrated. Note that understanding does not equate to agreement. And how do we ensure we have the proper presence? We need to be aware of what's important and cautious of investing too much of ourselves elsewhere. Again, for example, distractedly watching the television, listening to the radio, anything other than giving someone our full attention. With not enough attention on the present to control our fleshly response. If we do these things, we will find it easier to respond appropriately to our brethren. Keep in mind Proverbs 16, verse 21. "The wise in heart will be called understanding, and sweetness of speech increases persuasiveness." I think the modern version might just be, "You catch more flies with honey than with vinegar." And Proverbs 16, verse 32. "He who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who captures a city." If we work to strengthen these aspects of our character, we will find that we remain grounded in every conversation. We won't be distracted from our brethren and their needs. We will remember to listen to their needs, what they say, and perhaps even what they're struggling to say. Our goal is to clamp down on the wants of self and focus as much attention as possible on being a blessing to our brethren. Ask probing questions. Show loving interest, but don't try to push your own agenda. Refrain from solving things or diverting the conversation in your own direction, but try to always be learning. As we read in Proverbs chapter 1, verse 5, "A wise man will hear and increase in learning, and a man of understanding will acquire wise counsel." Brethren, if we listen appropriately to our brethren and are slow to speak, we will be demonstrating the love that we all should be developing. Let us work to develop good habits of listening and continue to practice them, because the flesh will always find a way to trip us up. A fourth grade teacher once asked her class, "What is listening?" After a few moments of silence, one little girl raised her hand. "Listening," she said, "is wanting to hear." I think that's an excellent summary. To God be the glory.